Picture, if you will, the walls of Troy. The sun hangs low over the ancient battlements, casting long shadows across a field littered with the remnants of 9 years of war. The air is thick with dust and the metallic scent of blood. And there, beneath those towering walls that have stood against the greatest army the world has ever known, something terrible is happening. A bronze chariot thunders across the plain, its wheels grinding against stone and earth. Behind it, dragged by leather cords, is the broken body of a man. Not just any man, but Hector, Prince of Troy, defender of his people, beloved son and father. The chariot makes its circuit once around the great walls, then again, and again. The body bounces and scrapes against the unforgiving ground, leaving a dark trail in the dust. Inside the chariot stands a figure that seems barely human anymore. His armor gleams with divine craftsmanship, but his eyes burn with something far darker than mere rage. This is Achilles, son of a goddess, greatest of all warriors. And in this moment, perhaps the most terrifying thing that has ever walked the earth, the people of Troy watch from their walls in horror and helpless fury. They have seen their hero fall, seen him stripped of his armor, seen his body defiled in ways that violate every law of gods and men. Yet they can do nothing but watch as the son of Thetis continues his grim procession, driven by a grief and rage so pure it seems to burn the very air around him. But how did it come to this? How did the greatest hero of the ancient world become something that frightened even the gods themselves? To understand that moment beneath Troy's walls, we must go back to the beginning, to a story that begins not with war, but with a choice that would echo through eternity. Tonight we journey into the complete story of Achilles, not just the warrior, but the man, the son, the friend, the monster, the hero, a figure whose very name still conjures images of glory and tragedy 3,000 years after the last stone of Troy fell to rubble. This is the story of a soul caught between two worlds, blessed and cursed by the gods, destined for a glory so bright it would burn away everything else he might have been. Chapter 1. Born between worlds. Long before the walls of Troy ever knew the sound of Greek bronze, there lived a sea nymph whose beauty could stop the hearts of gods and mortals alike. Thetis was her name, and she dwelt in the silver depths of the Aegean, dancing through underwater palaces of coral and pearl, surrounded by her 50 sisters, the Nereids. Her laughter was like the sound of waves against distant shores, and her hair flowed like kelp in the eternal currents of the deep sea. But Thetis carried a secret that would reshape the fate of the world. The fates themselves had spoken a prophecy about her future son, this child. They whispered in voices like the rustle of autumn leaves, would grow to become greater than his father, greater in strength, greater in fame, greater in the scope of his deeds. It was a prophecy that sent tremors through Olympus itself. Zeus, king of the gods, had pursued the beautiful sea nymph with the kind of relentless passion that had already filled the world with his divine offspring. But when the prophecy reached his ears, even the Thunderer himself hesitated. To father a son greater than Zeus was to court disaster beyond imagining. So too did Poseidon, lord of the seas, who had also looked upon Thetis with desire. The prophecy changed everything. No god could risk fathering a child who might one day challenge the very order of the cosmos. And so the gods made a decision that would echo through the ages. If Thetis must bear a son destined for greatness, let that son be mortal. Let him burn bright and brief, like a star that blazes across the night sky before fading into darkness. They would give her to a mortal king, and her divine blood would create something unprecedented, something caught between the eternal realm of the gods and the fleeting world of men. The mortal chosen for this honor was Peleus, king of Phthia. He was noble in bearing and brave in battle, but he was still only a man, and the thought of claiming a goddess as his bride filled him with both wonder and terror. The wedding itself became the stuff of legend. All the gods attended save one, and that single absence would later spawn a war that would consume a generation. But that night, as Peleus and Thetis were wed beneath stars that seemed to burn brighter than usual, there was only joy and the promise of something extraordinary to come. The sea nymph had agreed to the marriage, but she had not done so willingly. She knew what it meant. She knew the prophecy. She knew that in loving a mortal man and bearing his child, she was condemning herself to watch that child face a destiny that would break her immortal heart. The child came in the depths of winter, born as storms lashed the coast of Phthia, and the sea itself seemed to rage against the shore. From his first breath, it was clear that this was no ordinary infant. His eyes held a light that seemed almost silver, like his mother's domain, and his grip was strong enough to bend bronze. Thetis looked down at her son and saw the future stretching out before him like a road that led to glory and to darkness in equal measure. They named him Achilles, and from the moment he drew breath, the world held its breath as well. Here was the child the fates had spoken of, the son who would surpass his father, the one who would become the greatest warrior the world had ever known. But greatness, as Thetis knew all too well, was not the same thing as happiness. As the child grew, his dual nature became more apparent with each passing day. He possessed strength that no mortal child should have, speed that left grown men gasping in amazement, and reflexes that seemed almost supernatural. But with that divine gift came something else, something that would define his entire life, a capacity for emotion so intense it sometimes seemed as if his very soul might burst into flames. When Achilles laughed, it was like the sound of silver bells. When he wept, it was as if the sky itself was mourning. And when he grew angry, even as a small child, there was something in his eyes that made seasoned warriors step back and reach instinctively for their weapons. It was as if the very forces of nature had been compressed into the form of a boy, divine power barely contained within mortal flesh. Thetis watched all of this with the growing knowledge that time was running out. She had heard whispers of the future, caught glimpses in the play of light on water, and seen shadows of what was to come. There would be a war. There would be a choice. And that choice would determine not just her son's fate, but the fate of everyone who loved him. The prophecy hung over them like a sword suspended by the finest thread. Achilles would face a decision: a long life lived in obscurity, or a short life crowned with glory that would never fade. Most mothers would pray for their child to choose the former. But Thetis was not most mothers, and Achilles was not destined to be most sons. As she held him close on those winter nights, listening to the waves crash against the shore of Phthia, she whispered to him in the ancient language of the sea. She told him stories of heroes and monsters, of gods and mortals, of choices that echoed through eternity. And somewhere in those whispered tales, the seeds of his future were planted, growing in the fertile ground of a child's imagination. But imagination was one thing. Reality would prove to be something else entirely. For soon, the time would come to begin preparing this child of two worlds for a destiny that neither gods nor mortals fully understood. Soon, it would be time to transform a boy into a weapon, and a weapon into a legend. The education of Achilles was about to begin. Chapter 2. The education of a warrior. High in the mountains of Thessaly, where the peaks touched the realm of the gods and the forests held secrets older than civilization itself, there lived a creature unlike any other in the world. Chiron was his name, and though he bore the body of a horse from the waist down, he possessed the torso and mind of the wisest of men. But calling him simply wise would be like calling the ocean simply wet. Chiron was the teacher of heroes, the keeper of ancient knowledge, the bridge between the wild world of nature and the civilized world of men. When Peleus brought his young son to the centaur's mountain dwelling, the child was barely old enough to speak in full sentences, yet already there was something about him that made even Chiron pause in wonder. The boy's eyes held depths that seemed impossible in one so young, and when he moved, it was with a fluid grace that spoke of divine blood running in his veins. "So," the centaur said, his voice deep and resonant as distant thunder, "this is the child the prophecy speaks of." Peleus nodded, unable to quite meet the centaur's ancient gaze. "Teach him everything," he said simply. "Make him worthy of his destiny." Chiron studied the boy for a long moment, seeing not just what he was, but what he might become. "Destiny," he said quietly, "is not something one becomes worthy of. It is something one learns to bear." And so began the strangest education any child had ever received. Chiron's mountain was a world unto itself, where the natural and supernatural existed side by side in perfect harmony. Ancient trees whispered secrets in languages that predated human speech. Springs bubbled up from deep places in the earth, their waters carrying the taste of primordial wisdom, and everywhere the lessons began. But these were not the lessons of other young nobles. Achilles learned to read not just the written word, but the language of wind and weather, the stories told by animal tracks in fresh snow, the meaning behind the flight patterns of birds. Chiron taught him that true knowledge came not from books alone, but from understanding the deep connections that bound all living things together. The physical training was unlike anything the boy had ever experienced. Under Chiron's guidance, Achilles learned to run with the deer through morning mists, to swim in mountain pools so cold they would have killed an ordinary child, to climb cliff faces that would challenge the most experienced warriors. His divine heritage allowed him to push his body beyond mortal limits, but Chiron taught him that strength without wisdom was merely destructive force. "Power," the centaur would say as they sat by their evening fire, "is not about how much force you can bring to bear. It is about knowing when to use that force and when to hold it back." But perhaps the most unexpected lessons were those that had nothing to do with warfare at all. Chiron taught Achilles to play the lyre, his fingers learning to coax melodies that could make even the mountain winds fall silent to listen. He learned the healing arts, understanding that the same hands that could deal death could also preserve life. He studied the movements of the stars, learning to read the will of the gods in the wheeling constellations. "Why do I need to know these things?" the boy asked one evening, frustrated by a particularly difficult passage of music. "I'm going to be a warrior." Chiron's eyes crinkled with something that might have been amusement. "And what do you think a warrior is, young one? A man who knows only how to kill? Any brute can swing a sword. A true warrior understands life so completely that he knows the exact weight of what he takes when he ends it." As the seasons turned and the boy grew, other qualities began to manifest themselves. His strength became legendary among the creatures of the mountain. He could wrestle bears and emerge unscathed, could hurl spears farther than men twice his age, could run from dawn to dusk without showing signs of fatigue. But it was not just his physical capabilities that set him apart. There was an intensity to everything Achilles did that was both magnificent and slightly terrifying. When he laughed, it was with his entire being. When he grieved over a wounded animal they could not save, his sorrow seemed to echo through the very stones of the mountain. And when his temper was roused, there was something in his eyes that reminded even Chiron that this child carried the blood of ancient powers. It was during one such moment of rage that both teacher and student glimpsed the darkness that lay at the heart of Achilles' destiny. A group of bandits had attacked a village in the valley below, killing an old man who had sometimes brought honey to Chiron's mountain retreat. When news of the death reached them, Something in the boy's expression changed, and for a moment, Chiron saw not a child but something far more dangerous. "I'll kill them," Achilles said, and his voice carried a cold certainty that made the ancient centaur's blood run chill. "I'll kill them all." "And what will that accomplish?" Chiron asked gently. "Justice," the boy replied, and there was no doubt in his voice, no uncertainty, only a terrible divine certainty that made the very air around him seem to shimmer with potential violence. Chiron studied his student for a long moment, seeing the future laid out like a map of sorrow and glory. "Perhaps," he said finally. "But remember this, young one. Justice and vengeance may wear the same face, but they do not share the same heart. Learn to tell the difference, for someday your life may depend on it." The years passed like water flowing downhill, swift and impossible to stop. Achilles grew from a child into a young man, his body becoming a perfect fusion of divine strength and mortal form. Under Chiron's tutelage, he mastered every weapon known to the ancient world. He could use sword and spear, bow and javelin, with an ease that seemed almost supernatural. But more than that, he learned to think like a warrior, to see battles not just as moments of violence, but as puzzles to be solved, as dances where death was the price of a misstep. Yet for all his growth in skill and wisdom, there remained something wild and untamed in Achilles that even Chiron's patient teaching could not fully reach. It was as if some essential part of him belonged not to the civilized world of men, but to the older, darker realm of the gods themselves. When he fought, whether in practice or in the few real battles he had encountered, there was a moment when something else seemed to take control. Something that cared nothing for honor or mercy or the laws that governed ordinary mortals. "He frightens me sometimes," Peleus admitted to Chiron during one of his rare visits to the mountain. "When I look at him, I see a weapon that could reshape the world, but I also see something that might destroy it." The centaur nodded slowly, his ancient eyes reflecting depths of knowledge that spanned centuries. "He is becoming what he was always meant to become," Chiron said quietly. "The question is not whether he will be great. The question is whether that greatness will save him or consume him." As Achilles approached his 16th year, whispers began to reach even their remote mountain retreat. Ships were gathering. Kings were making alliances. Somewhere across the wine-dark sea, a prince had stolen another man's wife, and the greatest army the world had ever seen was beginning to assemble in response. But Thetis, watching from her realm beneath the waves, saw what others could not. She saw the threads of fate beginning to weave together into a pattern that would spell doom for her beloved son. The war that was coming would offer him everything he had ever dreamed of. Glory, honor, a name that would echo through eternity. It would also kill him. And so, as Achilles completed his education in the mountains and prepared to take his place among the heroes of the age, his divine mother began to weave plans of her own, plans that would keep him from the war, keep him from the destiny that called to him like a siren's song, plans that, like so many attempts to thwart fate, would only serve to ensure that destiny found its target, after all. Chapter 3. Hidden Among Women. The palace of King Lycomedes on the island of Skyros was renowned throughout the Aegean for many things. Its strategic position among the scattered islands made it a crucial stop for merchants and diplomats. Its king was known for his wisdom and his careful neutrality in the growing tensions between the great powers. But perhaps most famously, it was home to some of the most beautiful and accomplished young women in all of Greece. It was to this palace that Thetis brought her son in the dark of night, her divine powers cloaking their arrival from mortal eyes. But the Achilles who entered Skyros was not the same young man who had trained in Chiron's mountains. Gone were the bronze armor and weapons that marked him as a warrior. Gone, too, was the confident bearing that proclaimed his divine heritage. In their place was something that would have been impossible for anyone but a goddess to achieve. Achilles had been transformed into a maiden. The magic that accomplished this was subtle and profound, touching not just his appearance but something deeper. The broad shoulders became delicate. The calloused hands of a warrior became soft and pale. Even his voice changed, taking on the higher tones that would allow him to pass undetected among Lycomedes' daughters. But perhaps most remarkably, the fierce light in his eyes was dimmed to something that might pass for maidenly modesty. "Your name," Thetis whispered to her son as they stood hidden in the shadows outside the palace, "will be Pyrrha. You are a distant cousin, sent here for protection during the troubles that are brewing. You know nothing of war or weapons. You are gentle, accomplished in the arts that befit a noble maiden, and perhaps a little shy among strangers." Achilles, or Pyrrha as he must now be called, nodded slowly. The deception went against everything in his nature, but he had learned to trust his mother's wisdom, even when he could not understand it. "How long?" he asked, and even to his own ears, his voice sounded strange and foreign. "Until the danger passes," Thetis replied, though they both knew she meant until the war was over, until the prophecy had spent itself on other lives, until her son was safe from the destiny that would burn him up like a moth drawn to flame. The integration into the royal household was surprisingly smooth. King Lycomedes accepted the story of a distant relative seeking shelter, and his daughters welcomed the newcomer with the genuine warmth that characterized their household. Pyrrha was given chambers among the royal women, tutors to perfect the skills expected of a noble maiden, and gradually, a place in the daily rhythms of palace life. But playing a role and living a life were two very different things. For Achilles, accustomed to the freedom of the mountains and the straightforward nature of combat training, the world of court femininity was like learning to breathe underwater. Every gesture had to be considered, every word weighed against the character he was supposed to inhabit. He learned to weave, though his fingers that had mastered sword and spear struggled with the delicate work. He studied music and poetry, finding some comfort in the arts that Chiron had at least introduced him to. He participated in the gentle sports that were considered appropriate for noble women, archery competitions, and races that barely taxed his supernatural abilities. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of his deception was learning to be around other people without the natural authority that had always surrounded him. As Achilles, men had looked to him for leadership, had stepped aside when he passed, had spoken to him with the respect due to one marked by the gods. As Pyrrha, he was simply another face among many, expected to defer to others, to participate rather than lead, to blend in rather than stand out. The months passed slowly. News from the outside world filtered into the palace in fragments. A great army was indeed assembling at Aulis. The greatest heroes of the age were gathering under Agamemnon's banner. Ships beyond counting filled the harbor as preparations for the greatest expedition in memory took shape. And through it all, Achilles remained trapped in his disguise, watching from the sidelines as the war that should have been his destiny unfolded without him. The frustration was like a constant ache, a reminder of everything he was giving up in the name of safety. But there were compensations, unexpected ones that slowly changed the nature of his exile. Chief among these was Didamia, the youngest daughter of King Lycomedes, whose beauty was matched only by her quick wit and generous spirit. She was perhaps a year younger than Achilles, with dark hair that caught the light like polished bronze and eyes that seemed to hold secrets of their own. From their first meeting, There had been something between them that went beyond ordinary friendship. Didamia seemed to see through the careful mask of femininity that Achilles wore. Not to his true identity, perhaps, but to something deeper, something that the disguise could not entirely hide. "You're different from the others," she said to him one evening as they walked in the palace gardens, the scent of jasmine heavy in the warm night air. "Different how?" Achilles asked, his pulse quickening in a way that had nothing to do with combat or danger. "Stronger," she said simply. "Not in body, though there's that too. In spirit, as if you've seen things the rest of us can only imagine." It was a dangerous conversation, one that could have exposed everything. But instead of pulling back, Achilles found himself drawn deeper into connection with this remarkable young woman. They began to spend more time together, finding excuses to be in each other's company, sharing conversations that ranged from philosophy to poetry to dreams of the future. And somewhere in those conversations, something unexpected happened. Achilles began to fall in love. It was not the fierce, consuming passion that poets sang of, but something quieter and deeper. He found himself looking forward to Didamia's smile more than he had ever anticipated the clash of bronze on bronze. Her laughter became more precious to him than the praise of warriors. And when she looked at him with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul, he felt a peace that he had never known in all his years of training for war. The physical relationship that eventually developed between them was both natural and revolutionary. For Achilles, it was his first experience with love in all its complexity. For Didamia, it was love with someone she knew instinctively was unlike anyone she had ever met, even if she could not put her finger on exactly why. Their secret meetings in the hidden corners of the palace, their whispered conversations in the pre-dawn hours, the stolen kisses and gentle caresses, all of it became a world unto itself, separate from the roles they played in the daylight hours. And when Didamia told him that she was carrying his child, Achilles felt something shift in his understanding of what his life might become. For the first time since leaving Chiron's mountain, he began to wonder if his mother might be right. If the war and the glory and the destiny that waited across the sea might be worth sacrificing for this quieter but no less profound happiness. He imagined a life spent in Skyros, watching his child grow, growing old alongside Didamia, finding purpose in love rather than in combat. It was a beautiful dream. It was also doomed. For even as Achilles learned to find contentment in his disguise, forces beyond his control were working to draw him back into the web of fate that his mother had tried so hard to break. The war had begun in earnest, and it was not going well for the Greeks. Without their greatest warrior, they found themselves stalemated before the walls of Troy, bleeding strength and morale with each passing month. And so the greatest minds among the Greek leadership began to ask the question that would shatter Achilles' carefully constructed new life. Where was the son of Thetis? Where was the warrior the prophecies claimed would be the key to victory? And what would it take to bring him to the war that seemed impossible to win without him? The answer would come in the form of a visit from the craftiest hero of them all, a man whose cleverness was matched only by his ruthless determination to achieve his goals. Odysseus was coming to Skyros, and when he arrived, even the best disguise in the world would not be enough to hide the truth. The peaceful interlude was coming to an end. Chapter 4. The Gathering Storm. The harbour of Skyros had seen many ships over the years, but none quite like the vessel that appeared on the horizon one spring morning when the war at Troy was entering its second year. The ship flew no banner that the harbour master recognized, yet something about its sleek lines and purposeful approach suggested this was no ordinary merchant vessel. When it finally dropped anchor and its passengers came ashore, all doubt was removed. Odysseus, king of Ithaca, stepped onto the dock with the easy confidence of a man who had never met a problem he could not solve through wit or guile. Behind him came a small but carefully chosen retinue, warriors who looked like merchants, servants who moved with the precision of soldiers, and most tellingly, several chests that seemed far too heavy for their size. King Lycomedes received his unexpected guest with all the courtesy due to a visiting monarch, but there was wariness in his manner. News of the war had reached even peaceful Skyros, and with it had come stories of the lengths to which the Greek alliance would go to secure victory. Odysseus's reputation for cunning preceded him, and wise kings had learned to be cautious when the lord of Ithaca came calling. "My lord Odysseus," Lycomedes said as they shared wine in the palace's main hall, "to what do we owe the honor of this visit? Surely you have not come so far merely to enjoy our island's hospitality." Odysseus smiled, and there was something in that smile that spoke of secrets and hidden purposes. "You know me too well, my friend. I come seeking something that has been lost. Or perhaps I should say, someone who has chosen to remain hidden." The conversation that followed was a delicate dance of words and implications. Odysseus never directly accused Lycomedes of harboring Achilles, and Lycomedes never directly denied the possibility. But both men understood exactly what was being discussed, and both knew that the outcome of this conversation would have consequences that reached far beyond the shores of Skyros. "Suppose," Odysseus said finally, setting down his wine cup and fixing his host with a direct stare, "that such a person existed, and suppose that person had reasons for avoiding the conflict that has consumed so much of our world. What would it take to change such a person's mind?" "That would depend," Lycomedes replied carefully, "on whether that person's reasons were born of cowardice or wisdom, and if they were born of love." The question hung in the air between them like the blade of a sword. Both men knew they were no longer speaking in hypotheticals. Both knew that the careful game of words had reached its crucial moment. Meanwhile, in the women's quarters of the palace, Achilles was learning that deception, no matter how carefully maintained, could never be perfect. The arrival of Greek ships had sent ripples of excitement and apprehension throughout the palace, and with that excitement came questions and speculations that made his disguise feel suddenly fragile. "Did you see them?" Didamia whispered to him as they sat with the other women, ostensibly working at their weaving, but in reality consumed with curiosity about their visitors. "Real warriors with scars and everything. They say one of them is Odysseus himself." Achilles kept his eyes on his loom, but his hands had stilled. The name, Odysseus, sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the spring weather. If anyone could see through his carefully constructed deception, it would be the man whose cleverness was legendary throughout the Greek world. "They're just men," he said, trying to keep his voice level and feminine, no different from any others. But even as he spoke the words, he knew they were a lie. He could feel something changing in the very air of the palace, as if the arrival of these visitors had shifted some fundamental balance that could never be restored. The peaceful life he had built here, the love he had found with Didamia, the simple happiness of anonymity, all of it suddenly felt as fragile as spun glass. That evening, King Lycomedes announced that there would be a feast in honor of their guests, and that all the noble ladies of the household would be expected to attend. It was both an honor and a trap, Achilles realized. An honor for Odysseus, who would be entertained by the beauty and accomplishments of Skyros's finest women, and a trap for anyone who might be hiding among those women, forced to appear in public and submit to the keen scrutiny of the craftiest mind in all of Greece. The great hall had been transformed for the occasion. Tapestries depicting scenes of peace and prosperity hung from the walls. Musicians played gentle melodies that spoke of home and contentment rather than war and glory. and tables groaned under the weight of the finest foods the island could provide. It was, in every way, a celebration of the life that Skyros represented, civilized, refined, and mercifully removed from the violence that was consuming the rest of the world. Achilles entered the hall with the other women, moving with the practiced grace he had perfected over months of careful observation and imitation. His dress was a masterpiece of feminine elegance, pale blue silk that complemented his disguised complexion, adorned with silver jewelry that caught the torchlight. To any casual observer, he was simply another beautiful young woman, perhaps a bit taller than most, but nothing that would attract undue attention. But Odysseus was no casual observer. The Lord of Ithaca sat at the high table beside King Lycomedes, and his eyes seemed to catalogue every person who entered the hall. When his gaze fell upon the group of women, it moved from face to face with the methodical precision of a hunter tracking prey. For a moment, those famous eyes met Achilles' own, and the disguised hero felt his breath catch in his throat. Did he know? Had the deception been pierced in that single glance? Or was this simply the way Odysseus looked at everyone, as if they were puzzles to be solved, mysteries to be unraveled? The feast proceeded with all the pomp and ceremony that such occasions demanded. Course followed course, wine flowed freely, and conversation filled the hall with the gentle buzz of civilized discourse. Odysseus proved to be a charming guest, regaling the assembly with tales of his travels that were carefully edited to avoid the grimmer realities of the war. But through it all, Achilles could feel those intelligent eyes returning to him again and again, studying, evaluating, searching for something that seemed to hover just beyond recognition. "Tell me," Odysseus said during a lull in the conversation, his voice carrying clearly across the hall. "I have brought gifts for our gracious hosts, small tokens of appreciation from the Greek alliance, including some rare items we have acquired during our travels. I wonder if the noble ladies would do me the honor of examining them. I am told that women have a keener eye for beauty than we crude warriors." King Lycomedes smiled and nodded his approval, clearly pleased by the compliment to his household. "Of course, my lord Odysseus, my daughters and their companions would be delighted to see what treasures you have brought from your journeys." Servants appeared as if by magic, carrying the heavy chests that had accompanied Odysseus from his ship. They were opened with great ceremony, revealing contents that drew gasps of admiration from the assembled women. There were bolts of silk in colors that seemed to shift and change in the torchlight, jewelry crafted by master artisans from lands beyond the edges of the known world, perfumes that carried the exotic scents of distant gardens, and mirrors polished to such perfection that they seemed to reflect not just images but souls. The women gathered around the chests with excited chatter, examining the treasures with the appreciation of those who truly understood fine craftsmanship. Achilles found himself drawn forward with the rest, partly to maintain his disguise and partly out of genuine curiosity about what the legendary Odysseus might consider worthy gifts. But as he approached the first chest, something caught his eye that made his blood run cold. Buried beneath layers of silk and silver, almost hidden from casual view, was the gleam of bronze. Not the dull bronze of common household items, but the bright, deadly gleam of weapons. A sword hilt protruded just enough to be visible, and beside it, the distinctive curve of a spearhead. It was a trap. All of this, the gifts, the ceremony, the careful arrangement of treasures, it was all an elaborate snare designed to flush out exactly the person who should not be interested in weapons at all. Achilles forced himself to step back, to show only the polite interest that Pyrrha would display in such martial objects. But even as he tried to control his reaction, he could feel Odysseus watching him with the intensity of a cat watching a mouse hole. The other women continued their examination of the gifts, exclaiming over the beauty of the silks and the craftsmanship of the jewelry. But their movements around the chests gradually revealed more of the hidden weapons, until it became impossible to ignore their presence entirely. "Oh my," said one of Lycomedes' daughters, spotting the sword hilt. "What is this doing here among such beautiful things?" "A mistake, I fear," Odysseus said smoothly, rising from his place at the high table. "The chests were packed in haste, and some items from my personal collection seem to have been included by error. Please, don't let such crude implements of war disturb your appreciation of the finer things." But even as he spoke, his eyes never left Achilles' face. And in that moment, the disguised hero realized that the game was over. There would be no more pretending, no more hiding behind layers of silk and feminine grace. The trap had been sprung, and all that remained was to see who would emerge from it alive. What happened next occurred in the space of a heartbeat, yet it seemed to unfold with the slow precision of fate itself. A servant, perhaps acting on a prearranged signal, perhaps simply startled by the tension that had suddenly filled the hall, knocked over one of the torches that illuminated the space around the gift chests. The torch fell with a crash that echoed through the hall like the clash of arms, and in the sudden flare of scattered sparks and confused shadows, instinct took over where conscious thought had failed. Achilles moved, not with the careful, measured steps of a maiden startled by a sudden noise, but with the fluid, deadly grace of a warrior responding to a potential threat. His hand shot out, not to steady himself or seek protection, but to grasp the sword hilt that protruded from the chest. In one smooth motion that spoke of years of training and divine reflexes, he drew the blade and dropped into a combat stance that no amount of feminine disguise could possibly disguise. The hall fell silent. Even the musicians stopped playing, their instruments falling quiet as every eye in the room focused on the impossible sight before them. There, surrounded by scattered silks and fallen jewelry, stood a figure that was no longer even attempting to maintain the pretense of femininity. The careful posture was gone, replaced by the balanced readiness of a born killer. The modest expression had vanished, replaced by eyes that blazed with the light of battle joy. And in that hand, the bronze sword caught the torchlight and threw it back like captured fire. "Well," said Odysseus, and his voice carried a note of satisfaction that filled the hall like the sound of a key turning in a lock. "I believe we have found who we were looking for." King Lycomedes rose slowly from his seat, his face a mask of confusion and dawning realization. What is the meaning of this?" But Achilles was no longer listening to the voices around him. The moment the sword had filled his hand, something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of himself and his place in the world. The months of enforced peace, the gentle pleasures of court life, the quiet happiness he had found with Didamia, all of it suddenly seemed like a dream from which he was only now awakening. This was what he was, not a maiden to be protected, not a lover to be cherished, not a son to be hidden away from danger. He was a weapon forged by the gods themselves, tempered in the fires of divine prophecy, and shaped by the greatest teacher who had ever lived. He was Achilles, son of Thetis, student of Chiron, destined for glory that would echo through eternity. The sword in his hand seemed to sing with possibilities, and for the first time in months, he felt completely, perfectly alive. Slowly, deliberately, he straightened from his combat stance. The transformation was visible to everyone in the hall, as if the mere act of holding a weapon had burned away the last vestiges of his disguise. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the higher tones he had cultivated as Pyrrha. Instead, it rang out clear and strong, with the authority of one born to command. "I am Achilles," he said simply. And those 3 words changed everything. The hall erupted in chaos. Some of the women screamed, Whether from fear or excitement, it was impossible to tell. The men reached for weapons that weren't there, trained by long experience to expect violence when famous warriors revealed themselves unexpectedly. King Lycomedes sank back into his chair, his face gone pale with the realization of what this meant for his carefully maintained neutrality. But through it all, Odysseus smiled with the satisfaction of a craftsman who had just completed his masterpiece. "Achilles, son of Thetis," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade through silk. "The Greek alliance needs you. Troy's walls still stand, and they will continue to stand until the greatest warrior in the world takes his place among those who would see them fall." The moment had come. The choice that his mother had tried so desperately to help him avoid now lay before him like a crossroads. On one path lay the life he had built in Skyros: love, family, peaceful obscurity, and years to spend in quiet happiness. On the other lay everything his divine blood had destined him for: glory, honor, immortal fame, and a death that would come far too soon. Behind him, he could hear Deiodamia weeping. She had seen the transformation, had watched the person she loved disappear behind the mask of destiny that he could no longer deny. She knew, as surely as if the fates themselves had whispered it in her ear, that she was losing him to something greater and more terrible than any mortal love could compete with. Achilles stood at the center of the chaos, the sword still gleaming in his hand, and felt the weight of prophecy settling on his shoulders like a cloak made of starlight and shadow. The peaceful interlude was over. The greatest hero of the age had been found. The Trojan War could truly begin. Chapter 5. 9 years of glory and frustration. The harbor at Aulis had been transformed into something that defied easy description. What had once been a sleepy fishing port now hosted the largest fleet the world had ever seen. Ships stretched from one end of the bay to the other, their masts creating a forest of wood and rope that seemed to reach toward the very heavens. 1,000 black ships, the poets would later sing, though those who were there knew the true number was even greater. But it was not just the size of the fleet that took the breath away. It was what those ships represented. Every vessel carried warriors who had been legends in their own right before they ever set foot on a deck bound for Troy. Kings and princes, heroes whose names were already sung in the halls of distant kingdoms, men whose deeds had shaped the world they lived in, and now they were all united under a single banner, bound together by oaths and honor and the simple, terrible desire to bring down the walls of Troy. Achilles stood on the deck of his ship, the Myrmidons, and watched the controlled chaos of an army preparing for war. His vessels were among the finest in the fleet, carrying the 50 ships that Phthia had contributed to the cause. But more than that, they carried the warriors who would become the stuff of legend. The Myrmidons, named for the ants that Zeus had transformed into men, soldiers whose loyalty to their young king was absolute and whose skill in battle was matched only by their discipline. The transformation from the hidden maiden of Skyros to the war leader of the Myrmidons had been swift and total. Within days of his unmasking, Achilles had thrown himself into the preparations for war with an intensity that impressed even hardened veterans. He studied maps of the Trojan coast, learned the names and weaknesses of every enemy commander, and drilled his men until they moved as a single organism in battle. But perhaps more than anything else, he had embraced the identity that he had been running from for so long. The gentle arts he had learned from Chiron were not forgotten, but they were layered over now with something harder and more focused. This was Achilles as the gods had intended him to be, a perfect fusion of divine power and mortal purpose, a weapon aimed at the heart of Troy itself. The crossing to the Troad had been swift and relatively uneventful. though it had given Achilles his first real taste of commanding men in a campaign. The Myrmidons were veterans in their own right, many of them having served under Peleus, but they had never been led by someone so young. Yet from the first day, they had responded to his authority as if he had been born to it, which he had been. The initial landing on the beaches near Troy had been a scene of organized chaos. Thousands of warriors pouring from ships, establishing camps, setting up the infrastructure that would be needed for what many hoped would be a short campaign. The walls of Troy loomed in the distance, massive and seemingly impregnable, but the confidence of the Greek alliance was high. How could any city, no matter how well defended, stand against such a force? They would learn the answer to that question over the next 9 years. The early battles had been glorious affairs, at least from Achilles' perspective. The young hero had thrown himself into combat with a joy that was both inspiring and slightly terrifying to witness. He fought with the skill that Chiron had taught him, but also with something else, something that spoke of divine blood and destiny fulfilled. When he entered battle, it was as if the very air around him crackled with violent potential. His first major engagement had been against a Trojan force led by Cycnus, son of Poseidon and king of Colonnae. It was a fight that should have been evenly matched, God-born against God-born, divine strength against divine strength. Instead, it had been a revelation of just what kind of warrior the prophecies had foretold. Cycnus had been invulnerable to bronze weapons, his divine heritage protecting him from mortal harm. But Achilles had found another way, using the leather straps of the man's helmet to strangle him, proving that there was always a way to kill, always a weakness to exploit, if one was clever enough and ruthless enough to find it. The victory had sent shockwaves through both armies. Here was the young hero whose name had been whispered in prophecy, demonstrating that even the children of gods were not beyond his reach. The Greeks had celebrated that night as if the war were already won. The Trojans had sent scouts racing back to their city with news that their worst fears had been confirmed. Achilles, son of Thetis, had come to Troy, and he was everything the stories claimed and more. But as the months stretched into years, a different kind of reality had set in. Troy's walls remained standing, their massive stones untouched by Greek bronze despite battle after battle fought in their shadow. The city's defenders, led by Prince Hector, had proved to be more resilient and clever than anyone had anticipated. What was supposed to have been a swift campaign of conquest had become a grinding siege that seemed to have no end. For Achilles, this prolonged stalemate was a source of constant frustration. He had been born for decisive action, for the kind of glorious combat that settled matters once and for all. Instead, he found himself trapped in a war of attrition, winning battle after battle without ever achieving the victory that would justify the cost. And the cost was mounting steadily. Not just in lives, though those were precious enough, but in the slow erosion of purpose that came with endless fighting. Men who had started the war as heroes began to look more like bandits, raiding coastal settlements for supplies, taking slaves and treasure to compensate for the glory that seemed perpetually out of reach. Achilles himself was not immune to this corruption. As the years passed, his rage in battle began to take on a different quality. Where once it had been the clean fury of a warrior seeking victory, it now carried undertones of frustration and bitter disappointment. He began to take fewer prisoners, to show less mercy to the defeated, to let the divine madness that gripped him in combat burn hotter and longer than wisdom might have counseled. The other Greek leaders watched this transformation with a mixture of awe and unease. On one hand, Achilles remained their most effective weapon, the one warrior whose presence on a battlefield could tip the balance of an entire engagement. On the other hand, there was something in his eyes now that spoke of depths that even they found disturbing. Agamemnon, the overall commander of the Greek forces, had his complicated relationship with the young hero. The king of Mycenae was used to being the dominant figure in any gathering, accustomed to having lesser men defer to his authority and wisdom. But Achilles deferred to no one, acknowledged no authority save his divine heritage, and made it clear through word and deed that he considered himself Agamemnon's equal at the very least. The tension between them had been building for years, fed by countless small slights and moments of barely contained hostility. Agamemnon saw Achilles as an arrogant young man who needed to learn his place in the proper order of things. Achilles saw Agamemnon as a petty tyrant whose only claim to leadership was a political accident rather than any genuine qualification for command. Both men were proud. Both were used to being obeyed without question, and both were trapped together in a situation that was testing everyone's patience to the breaking point. But it was not just the relationship with Agamemnon that was changing as the war ground on. Achilles found himself increasingly isolated from his fellow heroes, set apart by abilities that grew more pronounced with each passing year. When he fought now, it was with a skill and fury that seemed almost inhuman. He could cut through enemy formations like a scythe through wheat, could face odds that would have destroyed any other warrior, and could inspire his men to feats of courage that bordered on the supernatural. Yet for all his success in battle, he remained as far from victory as ever. Troy's walls still stood. Hector still commanded the city's defenses with skill that matched Achilles' own. And the war that was supposed to have made him immortal was instead grinding him down day by day, victory by frustrating victory. It was during the 8th year of the siege that the incident occurred, which would change everything. A plague had struck the Greek camp, sent by Apollo in response to Agamemnon's refusal to return a captured priestess to her father. Men were dying by the dozens, and even the greatest heroes seemed powerless against this divine wrath. The solution, when it came, required Agamemnon to give up his prize. But kings do not easily surrender what they consider rightfully theirs, especially not when doing so means admitting error before their subordinates. If he must give up his captive, Agamemnon declared, then he would take another to replace her. And his choice fell upon Briseis, the Trojan woman who had been awarded to Achilles as his portion of the spoils. It was not the loss of a single woman that sparked what came next. It was the principle behind the taking, the casual dismissal of Achilles' rights and achievements, the assumption that the greatest hero of the age could be treated like any common soldier whose possessions existed at the pleasure of his commander. When Agamemnon's heralds arrived to claim Briseis, Achilles let them take her without resistance, but his eyes held a light that made even hardened warriors step back in instinctive fear. The son of Thetis had been pushed beyond the limits of his patience, and everyone who saw him in that moment understood that something fundamental had changed. "Tell your king," Achilles said to the heralds, his voice carrying with the terrible calm that comes before a storm, that he has made a choice today that will cost him everything. Tell him that when the Trojans are burning his ships and slaughtering his men, he will remember this moment and wish he had chosen differently. The heralds departed, and with them went any hope of compromise or reconciliation. The greatest warrior in the Greek army had withdrawn from the fight, and the consequences would reshape the entire course of the war. The wrath of Achilles had been unleashed, and not even the gods themselves could predict where it would lead. Chapter 6. The wrath that changed everything. The tent of Achilles stood apart from the rest of the Greek encampment, positioned on a small rise that overlooked both the battle lines and the distant walls of Troy. It had always been somewhat isolated, reflecting its occupants' unique status among the allied forces, but now that isolation took on a different quality entirely. Where once it had been the mark of honor, it now felt like exile. Inside that tent, the greatest warrior of the age sat in brooding silence, his divine armor laid aside, his famous spear resting against the tent pole like a sleeping serpent. The past few days had transformed him in ways that went beyond the merely physical. The rage that had always simmered beneath the surface of his composed exterior had finally found its focus, and that focus was not the enemies beyond Troy's walls, but the allies who shared his camp. Patroclus found him there as the sun set on the third day of his withdrawal from battle, sitting motionless in the growing darkness, his eyes fixed on something that existed far beyond the confines of the tent. "The men are asking questions," Patroclus said quietly, settling down beside his dearest friend and companion. "They want to know when you'll return to the fight." Achilles turned his head slightly, acknowledging the other man's presence without fully breaking his reverie. Patroclus was perhaps the only person in the world who could approach him in such a mood without fear of consequences. They had grown up together, trained together, fought together through countless battles. If Achilles had a weakness, it was his love for this gentle-hearted man who had somehow retained his humanity even amid so much violence. "Let them ask," Achilles replied, his voice carrying none of its usual warmth. "Let them wonder. Let them face the Trojans without me and learn what their high king's arrogance has cost them." "This isn't like you," Patroclus said, studying his friend's profile in the dim light. "You've never been one to let others suffer for the mistakes of their leaders, haven't I?" The question carried a bitter edge that Patroclus had rarely heard before. "Perhaps that was my mistake. Perhaps I've been too quick to forgive, too willing to overlook the slights and insults, too ready to put the good of the cause ahead of my honor." Outside the tent, they could hear the sounds of an army settling into evening routine. But there was something different about those sounds now, a quality of tension and uncertainty that had not been there before. The withdrawal of Achilles from the battle line had sent ripples through the entire Greek force, from the highest-ranking kings to the lowest camp followers. The immediate effects had been dramatic and unmistakable. Without their greatest champion leading the charge, the Greeks had found themselves pushed back steadily by Trojan forces emboldened by his absence. Battles that should have been decisive victories had become Pyrrhic draws. Engagements that might have broken enemy morale instead saw the Greeks giving ground they had held for years. But, perhaps more disturbing than the tactical reversals was the psychological impact. For 9 years, the Greek army had fought with the absolute confidence that came from having a warrior like Achilles among their ranks. He had been their ace in reserve, their guarantee that no matter how badly things went, they always had an answer to whatever the Trojans could bring against them. Now that guarantee was gone, and its absence was changing everything about how both armies approached the war. "Agamemnon has sent emissaries," Patroclus said after a long moment of silence. "Phoenix, Ajax, Odysseus. They're coming to speak with you." Achilles laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Of course he has. The great king has finally realized what his pride has cost him, and now he wants to negotiate. What does he offer? Gold? Slaves? Perhaps one of his daughters in marriage?" "All of those things," Patroclus admitted reluctantly. "And the return of Briseis, untouched, along with a formal apology before the assembled army." For a moment, something flickered in Achilles' eyes that might have been interest, but it faded quickly, replaced by something harder and more implacable than mere anger. "Too late," he said simply. "Some insults cannot be forgiven with gold and pretty speeches. Some wounds cannot be healed with apologies." The emissaries arrived as the night deepened, their approach announced by the measured tread of men who understood they were walking into a situation where the wrong word could have consequences far beyond their control. Phoenix came first, the old warrior who had helped raise Achilles from childhood, his weathered face creased with worry and affection. Behind him came Ajax, massive and straightforward, a man who had never been comfortable with complicated emotions but who understood loyalty and honor better than most. And finally Odysseus, his clever eyes already calculating angles and possibilities, searching for the words that might achieve what force could not. They were received with courtesy, but without warmth. Offered wine and food that none of them had much appetite for. The conversation that followed would be remembered and analyzed for generations, a pivotal moment when the course of the war and the fate of countless lives hung on the ability of words to bridge a chasm that seemed to grow wider with each passing moment. Phoenix spoke first, invoking memories of childhood, appealing to bonds of affection that had been forged over years of shared experience. His words painted pictures of the boy Achilles had been, the promises he had shown, the bright future that still awaited him if he could find it in his heart to forgive. Ajax followed with the blunt honesty that characterized everything he did, pointing out the practical realities of the situation, the lives that were being lost while the greatest of the Greeks sulked in his tent like a child denied a toy. But it was Odysseus who made the formal offer, laying out in detail the extent of Agamemnon's willingness to make amends. The treasures were magnificent, the slaves numerous and skilled, the political advantages of a marriage alliance substantial. It was an offer that would have satisfied any reasonable man, that represented a degree of groveling unprecedented from a king of Agamemnon's stature. Through it all, Achilles listened in silence, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. When the last word had been spoken, when the final inducement had been laid out for his consideration, he rose and walked to the entrance of his tent, looking out over the darkened camp toward the distant lights of Troy. "You offer me gold," he said finally, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "You offer me slaves and marriage alliances and the chance to return to the good graces of a king whose good graces are worth less than the bronze it takes to buy them." He turned back to face his visitors, and in the flickering torchlight, his face seemed carved from marble, beautiful and terrible and utterly implacable. "But what you cannot offer me is what I have lost. You cannot give me back the respect that was taken from me before the assembled army. You cannot restore the honor that was stripped away when your king decided that my achievements counted for less than his petty jealousy. And you cannot undo the moment when I realized that everything I have bled for, everything I have sacrificed, means nothing to the men I have fought beside for 9 long years." The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. These were not the words they had come to hear, not the response that their carefully prepared arguments had been designed to counter. "There is another offer," Odysseus said quietly, playing his final card. "Agamemnon is prepared to acknowledge you as his equal in all things. Joint command of the expedition, shared authority over strategic decisions, recognition before all the Greeks that you are indeed the greatest among us." For a moment, something flickered in Achilles' expression. The offer was unprecedented, a degree of concession that represented total capitulation on Agamemnon's part. It was everything that pride and honor demanded, and more. But then that moment passed, and his face hardened once again. "I have seen what Agamemnon's word is worth," he said. "I have learned what happens to men who trust in his promises and his friendship. Tell your king that he may keep his gold and his slaves and his daughters. Tell him that I withdraw not just from this battle but from this war. When dawn comes, I will take my ships and my men and sail for home. Let him see how well he fares against Hector without me." The threat hit the emissaries like a physical blow. Bad as Achilles' withdrawal from combat had been, the complete departure of the Myrmidons would be catastrophic. 50 ships' worth of the finest warriors in the Greek army, gone. The psychological impact alone would be enough to shatter what remained of Greek morale. "You cannot mean this," Phoenix said, his voice breaking with emotion. "This is not who you are, Achilles. This is not the man I helped to raise." "Perhaps," Achilles replied. "The man you helped to raise was a fool who believed that honor and loyalty were virtues that would be returned in kind. Perhaps it is time for that man to die, and for something harder to take his place. The emissaries departed in defeat, carrying with them news that would transform the nature of the conflict. Agamemnon's refusal to acknowledge his error had been disastrous. His eventual willingness to make amends had come too late. The greatest warrior of the age was lost to them, and with him any hope of a swift resolution to the war. But Achilles' withdrawal would have consequences that none of them, not even the wisest among them, could have foreseen. In removing himself from the conflict, he had created a vacuum that would eventually draw in the one person whose loss would drive him to heights of fury that would terrify gods and mortals alike. The wrath of Achilles had been kindled, and it would burn until it consumed everything he held dear. Chapter 7. The Price of Pride. The days following the failure of the embassy stretched into weeks, and the weeks into months, as the war entered a new and darker phase. Without Achilles leading the charges that had defined Greek strategy for nearly a decade, the entire character of the conflict began to change. What had been a siege punctuated by glorious battles became a grinding war of attrition that seemed to favor the defenders more with each passing day. From his self-imposed exile, Achilles watched the transformation with a mixture of satisfaction and growing unease. His absence was having exactly the effect he had intended. The Greeks were struggling, losing ground both literally and figuratively, forced to acknowledge daily the cost of insulting their greatest champion. Yet as the reports of defeats and casualties mounted, he found that his satisfaction was increasingly tempered by something he had not expected to feel: doubt. Patroclus spent long hours in the tent with his friend, watching the play of emotions across that familiar face, seeing the internal struggle that raged behind eyes that had once been so certain of their purpose. The withdrawal had been intended as a lesson, a demonstration of Achilles' indispensable value to the Greek cause. But lessons, once begun, had a way of taking on lives of their own, developing consequences that even their teachers could not control. "They're dying out there," Patroclus said one evening as they sat, listening to the distant sounds of battle. The Trojans had grown bold enough to push their attacks almost to the edge of the Greek camp, something that would have been unthinkable when Achilles was still fighting. "Men die in war," Achilles replied, though his voice lacked its former conviction. "That's what war is. These are our men," Patroclus pressed. "Greeks who followed us here, who trusted us to lead them to victory. They're dying because their greatest protector has abandoned them." The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Achilles flinched as if he had been struck, and for a moment his carefully maintained composure cracked enough to reveal the pain beneath. "I didn't abandon them," he said, but the protest sounded hollow even to his ears. "They abandoned me first. Agamemnon, the other kings, the very men who should have stood by me when my honor was attacked. And now they're paying the price for that failure," Patroclus said quietly. "But so are a lot of men who had nothing to do with Agamemnon's arrogance. So are warriors who have followed you faithfully for 9 years, who believe in you even now, even as they watch their friends die in battles you could have won." It was a conversation they had been having in various forms for weeks, each iteration more desperate than the last. Patroclus could see what the withdrawal was doing to his friend, could see the way honor and love and duty were tearing him apart from the inside. But he could also see what it was doing to the army they had sworn to serve. And that sight was becoming harder to bear with each passing day. The crisis came, as crises often do, without warning and with a speed that left no time for careful consideration. A messenger arrived at their tent in the pre-dawn hours, his face streaked with soot and blood, his words tumbling over each other in his haste to deliver news that could not wait for sunrise. "The ships," he gasped, falling to his knees before Achilles. "They're burning the ships. Hector has broken through the camp defenses. The whole army is falling back to the beach." Achilles was on his feet before the man had finished speaking, every instinct screaming at him to reach for his armor, to call his men to battle, to race to the defense of the fleet that represented the Greek army's only link to home. But another voice, the voice of wounded pride and justified anger, held him motionless. "Let them burn," he said, though the words seemed to tear at his throat. "Let Agamemnon see what his kingdom is worth when he has no ships to return to it." But even as he spoke, he could see the horror in Patroclus's eyes, could feel the weight of a decision that was slipping beyond his control. The burning of the ships would mean more than just the destruction of the Greek expedition. It would mean the death or enslavement of every Greek warrior on the Trojan coast, including his own beloved Myrmidons. "You cannot mean this," Patroclus whispered. "Not this far. Not when it means the destruction of everything we've fought for." "What have we fought for?" Achilles demanded, his voice rising to a roar that could be heard throughout the camp. "Glory, honor, the right to be treated like cattle by kings who see us as nothing more than tools to be used and discarded. Let it all burn. Let Agamemnon learn the cost of his arrogance." But even as the words left his lips, Achilles could see that he was losing the one person whose opinion mattered more to him than life itself. Patroclus was looking at him with an expression of such profound disappointment that it cut deeper than any bronze blade ever could. "Then let me go," Patroclus said quietly. "If you will not save them, let me try." The request hung in the air between them like a sword blade catching the light. For a moment, neither man spoke, both understanding that they had reached a crossroads from which there might be no return. "You," Achilles said, his voice suddenly hollow, "against Hector, against the full might of Troy unleashed." "In your armor," Patroclus replied, his words measured and deliberate. "Let me wear your arms. Lead the Myrmidons in one last charge. I don't need to defeat Hector. I just need to drive them back from the ships, to buy time for the army to regroup." The suggestion was both brilliant and terrifying. The sight of Achilles' distinctive armor on the battlefield would rally the Greeks and potentially panic the Trojans, at least initially. Patroclus was a skilled warrior in his own right, capable of leading men and inspiring courage even if he lacked his friend's supernatural abilities. But he was not Achilles. He did not carry divine blood in his veins, did not possess reflexes that bordered on prescience, did not have the kind of battle fury that could turn the tide of an entire war. Against ordinary opponents, the deception might work. Against Hector, Prince of Troy and greatest of the enemy champions, it would be little more than elaborate suicide. "No," Achilles said, the word emerging with finality that seemed to echo from the very depths of his soul. "I will not lose you to satisfy Agamemnon's pride." "You're not losing me to Agamemnon," Patroclus replied, stepping closer, his eyes blazing with the kind of desperate certainty that comes when a man sees his duty with perfect clarity. "You're losing me to my conscience. I cannot sit here while good men die for the sake of your wounded pride." The accusation struck home with devastating force. Wounded pride. Was that all this was? Was that what his righteous anger had become? Nothing more than the petulance of a man who had been denied his due recognition. "It's not pride," Achilles said, but his voice lacked conviction. "It's justice. It's the natural consequence of treating the greatest warrior in the world like a common foot soldier whose possessions exist at the pleasure of his betters. And how many common foot soldiers have died while you pursued that justice?" Patroclus asked. "How many men who never wronged you, who followed you faithfully for 9 years, who would die for you without question if you but gave them the chance?" The questions cut deep because they were the same ones that had been haunting Achilles' dreams for weeks. In his anger at Agamemnon, he had convinced himself that his withdrawal was a principled stand, a necessary demonstration of the consequences of dishonor. But the line between principle and selfishness was thinner than he had wanted to acknowledge, and with each passing day it became harder to tell which side of that line he was standing on. "Please," Patroclus said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more force than any shout. "Let me do this one thing. Let me save them if you will not." And there, in that moment of desperate pleading, Achilles saw something that shattered the last of his resistance. He saw himself as Patroclus saw him. Not a hero standing on principle, but a man so consumed with his grievances that he was willing to let others pay the price for them. The armor came off its stand slowly, each piece feeling heavier than mountains, as Achilles helped his dearest friend prepare for what they both knew would likely be his final battle. The bronze had been crafted by masters, fitted specifically to Achilles' divine proportions. But Patroclus wore it with a grace that made it seem as if it had been made for him instead. "Promise me," Achilles said as he fitted the great helmet over his friend's head. "Promise me you'll be careful. Drive them back from the ships, yes, but don't pursue them. Don't let the battle joy take you the way it takes me. Come back to me alive, and we'll find another way to end this war." Patroclus reached out and gripped his friend's shoulder, and in that touch was everything they had shared over the years. Childhood adventures, shared training, the bond forged in countless battles, the love that had sustained them both through the darkest moments of the war. "I promise," he said simply. But promises made in the shadow of desperate necessity are fragile things, easily broken by the chaos of battle and the unpredictable tides of war. As Patroclus strode from the tent to rally the Myrmidons, as the war cries began to echo across the Greek camp, as the tide of battle prepared to turn once more, neither man could know that they had just set in motion events that would transform the very nature of the conflict. The Myrmidons responded to their leader's call with the enthusiasm of men who had been straining at the leash for months. To see their beloved commander's armor once again gleaming in the sunlight, to hear the orders that would finally return them to the battle they lived for, was like water to men dying of thirst. They formed up with the precision that had made them legendary, their bronze spears creating a forest of deadly points, their shields locked together in formations that had broken enemy lines from one end of the ancient world to the other. And at their head, wearing the armor that had become synonymous with Greek victory, strode the figure they believed to be Achilles himself, returned at last to claim his rightful place among the heroes of the age. The charge that followed would be remembered and sung about for generations. The Myrmidons struck the Trojan forces like a divine thunderbolt, cutting through their ranks with a fury that seemed to channel all the pent-up frustration of their long inactivity. The sight of Achilles' distinctive armor on the battlefield sent shockwaves through both armies, rallying the Greeks and spreading confusion among their enemies. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed as if the deception would succeed beyond their wildest hopes. The Trojans, who had been pressing their attack with growing confidence, suddenly found themselves facing the one warrior they had hoped was gone forever. Their advance faltered, then broke, then became a full retreat as panic spread through their ranks like wildfire. Patroclus, caught up in the intoxication of victory, felt the same battle joy that had always driven his friend to such heights of achievement. The weight of Achilles' armor seemed to imbue him with strength beyond his natural abilities, and for a few precious moments, he truly felt like the greatest warrior in the world. But strength borrowed from another's reputation is not the same as strength that comes from within. And when Prince Hector, greatest of the Trojan champions, finally rallied his men and turned to face what he believed to be his greatest enemy, the illusion began to crumble with terrifying speed. The duel that followed was brief and decisive. Patroclus fought with skill and courage that would have honored any warrior, but he was facing an opponent who had been trained from birth to face the best the world could offer. when the bronze spear of Hector found its mark, when the borrowed armor finally failed to protect the man who wore it, when the greatest deception of the war came to its inevitable end, something fundamental shifted in the cosmic balance that had defined the conflict. Achilles, son of Thetis, had lost the one thing he valued more than his own life. And in losing it, he had found something that would make him more terrible than he had ever been before. The wrath that had driven him to withdraw from battle was nothing compared to the grief and fury that would drive him back to it. The real war was about to begin. Chapter 8. Vengeance and Divine Armor. The scream that tore from Achilles' throat when the news reached him was not entirely human. It carried in it something of the sea winds that were his mother's domain, something of the divine rage that flowed in his immortal blood, something of the primal anguish that comes when the foundations of a man's world are shattered beyond all hope of repair. Antilochus, son of Nestor, had drawn the terrible duty of bringing word of Patroclus's death. He approached the tent with the reluctant steps of a man walking to his own execution, knowing that the message he carried would transform the greatest warrior of the age into something that might no longer be entirely safe to be around. He found Achilles sitting exactly where he had been when Patroclus left for his final battle, as if he had not moved in all the hours that had passed since then. But when the young herald began to speak, when the words came tumbling out in a desperate rush of grief and apology, the transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The divine nature that Achilles had always carried within him, carefully controlled and channeled through years of training and discipline, erupted in a display of raw power that made the very earth tremble. His scream of anguish rose to the heavens, and it seemed as if the sky itself darkened in response. Animals for miles around fell silent, sensing the presence of something that transcended ordinary mortal grief. But it was not just the sound that testified to the depth of his loss. Achilles began to tear at himself with his own hands, clawing at his face and arms until blood flowed freely, pulling at his golden hair until strands came away in his fingers. The physical pain was nothing compared to the agony in his soul, but it was all he could do to express an anguish that seemed too large for any mortal frame to contain. "Gone," he whispered, and the word carried such desolation that even hardened warriors who heard it felt tears spring to their eyes. "My other self, my heart, my soul." The camp that had been buzzing with the news of the day's battle fell into an uncomfortable silence as word spread of Achilles' reaction. Men who had seen him face impossible odds without flinching now spoke in whispers about the sounds that emerged from his tent. Sounds that spoke of a kind of suffering that went beyond anything they had experienced in 9 years of war. But the grief was only the beginning. As the hours passed and the reality of his loss began to settle into his bones, something else began to emerge from the wreckage of his shattered heart. Something darker and more dangerous than mere sorrow. Something that would make the Achilles who had withdrawn from battle seem gentle by comparison. Rage. Pure, distilled, divine rage that burned with the heat of a forge and the inevitability of a natural disaster. It was then that Thetis came to him, rising from the depths of the wine-dark sea with her train of sister Nereids, their immortal faces streaked with tears for the mortal they had all come to love. She found her son as she had found him in his earliest years, lost in a grief too large for comfort, too deep for easy healing. "My child," she whispered, gathering him into arms that had once rocked him to sleep with lullabies sung in the ancient language of the deep. "My beautiful, doomed child." "He's gone," Achilles said, and his voice was empty of everything that had once made it remarkable. "Patroclus is gone, and it's my fault. My pride, my anger, my refusal to bend when bending would have saved him." "You loved him," Thetis replied, her voice thick with the weight of maternal sorrow. "Love is not a fault, even when it leads to pain." "Love," Achilles laughed, and the sound was bitter as wormwood. Is that what this was? Then love is a curse, and I want no more of it. All I want now is vengeance. All I want is to make Hector pay for what he has done. Thetis pulled back to look at her son's face, and what she saw there made her immortal heart tremble. She had known this moment would come, had seen it in the patterns of wave and wind, in the dreams that came to those who dwelt beneath the sea. This was the moment the prophecy had spoken of, the choice that would define everything that followed. If you return to battle, she said slowly, if you seek this vengeance you crave, then you will die soon after. The fates have decreed it. Kill Hector, and your death will follow as surely as dawn follows night. Then I die, Achilles replied without hesitation. But I will not live in a world that holds Hector while Patroclus lies cold in the ground. Better a short life crowned with the vengeance I owe my friend than long years spent knowing that his killer still draws breath. It was the choice the prophecy had always pointed toward. The moment when glory and grief would combine to drive him toward a destiny that had been written in the stars before his birth. Thetis had tried to prevent it, had hidden him among women, had done everything in her power to keep him from this moment. But fate, once set in motion, was not easily deflected. Then I will give you armor worthy of your purpose, she said, her voice carrying the weight of final acceptance. If you must die a hero's death, you will do so clad in bronze that even the gods will envy. The journey to Hephaestus's forge took her through the deepest parts of the ocean, past places where the light of the sun had never penetrated, to caverns filled with the ringing of divine hammers and the roar of fires that burned hotter than mortal flames could ever achieve. The god of the forge received her with the courtesy due to one of his fellow immortals, but his twisted features showed surprise at her unprecedented request. Armor for a mortal, he asked, his voice like the rumble of distant thunder. Even for your son, this is no small thing you ask of me. He is not just any mortal, Thetis replied. He is the child of prophecy, the warrior who will decide the fate of Troy, and he needs protection that mortal smiths cannot provide. What followed was a night of creation that would become legendary among the gods themselves. Hephaestus worked with materials that existed nowhere else in creation, bronze mixed with starlight and silver drawn from the heart of the moon. The shield alone took hours to complete, its surface decorated with scenes that told the story of the entire world. Cities at peace and cities at war, farmers harvesting their crops and warriors falling in battle, the great dance of life and death that defined mortal existence. But it was not just the beauty of the craftsmanship that made the armor special. Hephaestus had woven into every piece protections that went beyond the merely physical. This was armor designed to turn aside not just bronze and iron, but the kind of supernatural forces that a hero might face in his final battles. When Thetis returned to the Greek camp carrying the completed set, the very air around her seemed to shimmer with barely contained power. The armor gleamed with its inner light, and when she laid it at her son's feet, even the hardened warriors who glimpsed it from a distance felt their breath catch in their throats. "Wear this," she said, "and you will be protected from any weapon that mortal hands can wield. But remember, my son, that no armor can protect the heart from the choices it makes. No bronze, however divinely wrought, can turn aside the spear that destiny throws." Achilles knelt and began to arm himself with a ceremony that felt like a religious ritual. Each piece of the divine bronze seemed to fuse with his skin, becoming not just protection but an extension of his very being. When the great helmet settled over his golden hair, when the shield took its place on his left arm, when the spear of Pelion filled his right hand, he was no longer quite the same man who had grieved in the darkness of his tent. He had become something new, something terrible, something that would make the earth itself tremble when he walked upon it. The transformation was visible to everyone who saw him emerge from his tent as dawn broke over the Trojan plain. The Achilles who had withdrawn from battle in wounded pride was gone, replaced by a figure that seemed to burn with its own inner fire. The divine armor caught the first rays of sunlight and threw them back in dazzling displays that hurt to look upon directly. But it was not just the armor that marked the change. Everything about him was different now, from the way he moved to the expression in his eyes. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it had been transmuted into something harder and more focused. This was grief weaponized, sorrow transformed into a force that could reshape the world. The Myrmidons who had followed Patroclus to his death now gathered behind their true leader, and they too seemed different, marked by their grief and their desire to avenge their fallen comrade. They formed up with the precision of men who knew they were about to fight the most important battle of their lives, their bronze spears gleaming like a forest of deadly stars. "Today," Achilles said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled ranks, "we go to collect a debt that has been owed too long. Today, we make Hector pay for what he has stolen from us. Today, we show Troy what it means to wrong the son of Thetis." The war cry that rose from Greek throats was like nothing that had been heard before, carrying in it not just the hope of victory, but the promise of vengeance that would satisfy the shades of the dead. And at the head of that avenging host, clad in bronze that gleamed like captured sunlight, strode the greatest warrior the world had ever known, finally unleashed to do what he had been born to do. The final act of the Trojan War was about to begin. Chapter 9. The Duel at Troy's Gates. The plain before Troy had witnessed many battles over the long years of the siege, but nothing in all that time had prepared it for what was unleashed when Achilles returned to war. He moved across the landscape like a force of nature, less a man than an embodiment of divine wrath given flesh and bronze and terrible purpose. The Trojans, who had grown bold during his absence, who had pushed their attacks to the very edge of the Greek camp, suddenly found themselves facing something beyond their experience or understanding. Where ordinary warriors fought with skill and courage, Achilles fought with the fury of the gods themselves, cutting through their ranks with an ease that seemed to mock everything they thought they knew about combat. His divine armor blazed in the morning sun as he carved a path of destruction through the enemy lines, and behind him, the Myrmidons followed like wolves unleashed after long captivity. They had their grief to satisfy, their debts to collect, and they pursued their vengeance with a methodical thoroughness that left no doubt about their intentions. But it was not enough to simply win battles, not anymore. Achilles had not returned to the war for victory in any conventional sense. He had come for one purpose only, to find Prince Hector of Troy and exact the payment that honor demanded for the death of Patroclus. The search consumed him completely, driving him from one end of the battlefield to the other in pursuit of the man who had stolen everything that mattered to him. Lesser Trojan champions fell before his spear like wheat before a scythe, but their deaths brought him no satisfaction. They were not the ones he sought, not the debt he had come to collect. From the walls of Troy, King Priam and his family watched in growing horror as the son of Thetis methodically dismantled their armies. The old king had ruled for decades, had seen countless warriors in all that time, but never anything like the figure that now dominated the plain before his city. This was not just a man fighting. This was wrath itself given form and let loose upon the world. "Where is your brother?" Priam asked, his voice tight with fear as he watched Achilles cut down another group of Trojan warriors with contemptuous ease. "Preparing," Paris replied, though his voice betrayed the uncertainty he felt. "Hector is gathering his courage for what must be done." But gathering courage for a battle against Achilles was like trying to prepare for combat with a natural disaster. How does one find the strength to face an opponent who seems to transcend the normal limitations of mortal flesh? How does one steel oneself to meet in single combat a warrior who appears to be more god than man? Hector, greatest of Troy's champions, stood in his father's palace and struggled with exactly those questions. He had known this moment would come, had felt it approaching like a storm on the horizon, but knowing and facing were very different things. Through the windows he could hear the sounds of battle, could hear the screams of men dying beneath Achilles' relentless advance. "You don't have to do this," his wife Andromache whispered, her arms wrapped around their young son as if she could protect him from the future that was bearing down upon them all. "There's no shame in seeking safety behind the city's walls. Let him rage outside. Eventually his fury will burn itself out." But Hector knew better. He had seen what happened to cities that tried to wait out heroes like Achilles. The son of Thetis would not simply grow tired and go home. He would find a way to bring down Troy's walls, to reach into the heart of the city itself, and when he did, the slaughter would make everything that had come before seem gentle by comparison. "I killed his friend," Hector said simply. "I took Patroclus's life, and now the debt must be paid. If I hide behind these walls, I condemn everyone in this city to share my fate." It was the logic of heroes, the mathematics of honor that demanded blood for blood, life for life. But it was also the logic of love. For Hector's greatest strength had always been his devotion to those who depended on him. He would face Achilles, not because he believed he could win, but because it was the only way to protect the people he cherished above his own life. The arming that followed was conducted in silence. Each piece of bronze fitted into place with the solemnity of a funeral rite. Hector's armor was fine work, crafted by the best smiths in Troy, but it seemed inadequate compared to the divine protection that gleamed on his opponent's frame. Still, it was what he had, and he wore it with the dignity that had always marked his character. His farewell to his family was brief and heartbreaking. Words seemed inadequate to encompass everything he felt, everything he wanted to say, everything he would never have the chance to express. In the end, he simply held them close and tried to memorize the feel of their embrace, the scent of their hair, the sound of their breathing. "Remember me," he whispered to his son, who was too young to understand what was happening, but old enough to sense the weight of the moment. "Remember that your father loved you more than life itself." Then he was gone, striding through the corridors of the palace toward the gates that would open onto his destiny. Behind him, he left a wife and child who would never see him alive again, a father who would soon be begging for the return of his son's corpse, and a city that was about to lose its greatest protector. The gates of Troy swung open with a groan that seemed to echo across the entire plain, and through them walked Prince Hector, son of Priam, defender of his people, doomed hero of a doomed city. He carried his bronze spear with practiced ease, his shield gleaming in the afternoon sun, his helmet casting shadows that fell across features carved by years of war and responsibility. Across the battlefield, Achilles saw him immediately. It was as if some divine hand had cleared the air between them, removing all distractions, all other considerations, leaving only the two figures who were about to settle an account that had been building for months. The plain fell silent as both armies realized what was about to happen. Greeks and Trojans alike drew back, creating a circle of space around the two champions. This was no longer their battle to fight. This had become something larger and more fundamental, a confrontation between forces that transcended ordinary warfare. Achilles began to walk toward his opponent, and each step seemed to shake the earth beneath his feet. The divine armor blazed with its inner light, and the spear of Pelion hummed with barely contained energy. His face was set in lines of implacable determination, his eyes burning with the cold fire of absolute purpose. Hector waited for him, and in that waiting was all the courage that mortal man could summon. He knew he was about to die. The prophecies were clear, the omens unmistakable, the simple reality of facing Achilles sufficient to convince anyone with sense that this duel could have only one outcome. But he stood his ground anyway, because duty demanded it. After all, love required it. Because sometimes the only choice a hero has is how he meets his doom. When they finally came within speaking distance, both men paused. For a moment, the weight of history seemed to settle around them like a cloak, the awareness that this moment would be remembered and sung about for as long as men told stories of war and courage and the price of honor. "Hector," Achilles said, and his voice carried across the silent plain like the tolling of a funeral bell. "Son of Priam, killer of Patroclus, your time has come." "I know," Hector replied, and his voice was steady despite everything. "I have no illusions about what awaits me here, but I will not make it easy for you, son of Thetis. I will not die without giving you reason to remember this day." Then they were moving, two figures that represented the pinnacle of mortal achievement, closing the distance between them with the deadly grace of born killers. The sound of bronze meeting bronze rang out across the plain like thunder, and the final duel of the Trojan War began in earnest. What followed was less a battle than a dance choreographed by the fates themselves, each movement perfectly balanced against its counter, each attack met by a defense that seemed to anticipate it. For a few precious moments, Hector matched his legendary opponent stroke for stroke, his skill and courage allowing him to hold his ground against odds that should have been insurmountable. But courage and skill, however great, could not bridge the gap between mortal and divine. Gradually, inevitably, Achilles' superior strength and speed began to tell. His attacks came faster, hit harder, and found their marks with increasing frequency. Hector's responses grew more desperate, more defensive, as he was slowly but steadily driven back. The end, when it came, was swift and decisive. Achilles found the gap in his opponent's guard that he had been creating through dozens of exchanges, and the spear of Pelion slid home with a sound that seemed to silence the world itself. Hector fell with the grace that had marked his entire life, and as he lay dying on the plain before Troy, his eyes found those of the man who had killed him. "Promise me," he whispered, his voice barely audible but carrying clearly in the sudden stillness. "Promise me you'll return my body to my father. Let me be buried with honor, as befits a warrior who died defending his people." For a moment, something flickered in Achilles' eyes that might have been the ghost of the mercy he had once possessed. But then he remembered Patroclus, remembered the grief that had driven him to this moment, and his face hardened once more. "You showed no mercy to my friend," he said, his voice like winter wind across a grave. "Why should I show any to you?" And with those words, he began the desecration that would stain his name for all eternity. Chapter 10. The darkness that followed. The leather cords that bound Hector's ankles to Achilles' chariot had been cut from the same hide that once protected Trojan warriors in battle, a bitter irony that was lost on no one who witnessed what followed. As the bronze wheels began to turn and the horses strained against their harnesses, the greatest hero of Troy began his final, terrible journey around the walls of the city he had died defending. From the ramparts above, the screams of grief and horror that rose from Trojan throats seemed to tear the very fabric of the sky. King Priam, who had ruled for decades with wisdom and dignity, collapsed against the stone battlements as if his aged frame could no longer support the weight of what he was witnessing. Queen Hecuba tore at her hair and beat her breast in a display of maternal anguish that made even hardened warriors weep. But perhaps most heartbreaking of all was the wail that came from Andromache, Hector's beloved wife, as she watched her husband's body being dragged like refuse behind the chariot of his killer. "My husband!" she cried, her voice carrying across the plain with a clarity that seemed to pierce every heart that heard it. "My noble husband, who never knew defeat until this day. What has become of the man I loved, the father of my child, the hope of our people?" But Achilles heard none of it, or if he did, it moved him not at all. The grief and rage that had driven him back to battle had not been satisfied by Hector's death. Instead, they seemed to have grown stronger, fed by violence until they had become something that consumed everything else he might once have been. The man who had learned mercy and music from Chiron, who had shown compassion to countless defeated enemies, who had once wept over wounded animals, was gone. In his place was something darker, something that cared nothing for honor or pity, or the ancient laws that governed proper treatment of the dead. 3 times the chariot made its circuit of Troy's mighty walls, and 3 times Hector's body bounced and scraped against the unforgiving ground, leaving a trail of blood and torn flesh that marked the path of Achilles' vengeance. The divine armor blazed in the afternoon sun as if reflecting the fires of some internal furnace, and the face beneath the bronze helmet was set in lines of such implacable hatred that even the gods themselves grew troubled. It was not enough. Even this ultimate degradation of his enemy's corpse could not fill the void that Patroclus' death had torn in his soul. If anything, the sight of Hector's broken body only reminded him of his own loss, only emphasized the terrible absence that no amount of vengeance could ever fill. When the grim procession finally returned to the Greek camp, Achilles dragged his prize directly to the tomb that had been erected for Patroclus, a monument of white marble that gleamed like captured moonlight in the gathering dusk. There, in the shadow of his friend's final resting place, he threw Hector's battered corpse into the dust and spoke to the shade of the man he had loved above all others. "See, Patroclus," he whispered, his voice hoarse from the day's exertions. "See how I have avenged you. Your killer lies in the dirt at your feet, dishonored and broken, food for dogs and carrion birds. Is this enough? Can you rest now, knowing that the debt has been paid?" But the dead, if they heard him at all, offered no reply. The silence that greeted his questions was more profound than any words could have been, a reminder that vengeance, however complete, could not restore what had been lost. Patroclus was gone, and no amount of blood could bring him back. That night, as the Greek camp settled into an uneasy quiet, Achilles found no peace in sleep. His dreams were haunted by visions of his friend's ghost, images that seemed more real than the waking world around him. Sometimes Patroclus appeared as he had been in life, laughing and vital, reaching out with hands that seemed almost solid enough to touch. Other times he came as he had died, broken and bloody, his eyes filled with an accusation that cut deeper than any weapon. "Why do you dishonor the dead?" the shade asked in one particularly vivid dream. "This is not who you were meant to be, Achilles. This is not the man I loved." "I did it for you," Achilles replied, reaching out desperately toward the fading figure. "Everything I've done, every life I've taken, every law I've broken, it was all for you." "No," the ghost whispered, as it began to dissolve like morning mist. "It was for yourself, for your pain, your anger, your inability to let go. You have made my death an excuse for becoming a monster." Achilles woke with a scream caught in his throat, his body drenched in sweat despite the cool night air. Around him, the camp slept on, unaware of the torment that gripped their greatest champion. But sleep, when it came to him at all, brought no rest, only more visions of reproach and loss. The days that followed established a grim routine. Each morning, Achilles would rise and arm himself with the methodical precision of a man performing a ritual. He would harness his divine horses to his chariot, bind the leather cords to Hector's ankles, and begin another circuit of Troy's walls. The body, preserved by some divine intervention from the decay that should have claimed it, continued to serve as the focus for a grief that seemed to grow stronger rather than weaker with each passing day. The other Greek leaders watched this spectacle with growing unease. Even men who had grown hardened by 9 years of brutal warfare found something disturbing about the sight of their greatest hero dragging an enemy's corpse around like a trophy. It violated the codes of honor that governed proper conduct in war, offended the gods who demanded decent treatment for the dead, and spoke of a darkness in Achilles' soul that made even his allies uncomfortable. Chapter 11. A Father's Plea. The relentless circuits of Achilles' chariot around Troy's walls had become a grim ritual, a spectacle that seemed to drain the very light from the sky. Each morning, as the first rays of dawn touched the plain, the son of Thetis would emerge from his tent, his divine armor gleaming like a warning to both gods and men. The leather cords, now stained dark with blood and earth, were fastened once more to Hector's ankles, and the chariot would begin its terrible journey. The Trojans, watching from their battlements, no longer cried out in rage or grief. Their voices had grown hoarse, their spirits numbed by the endless desecration of their greatest hero. But on the 10th day, something changed. As Achilles prepared to begin his daily procession, a murmur rippled through the Greek camp, carried on the lips of sentries who had seen an unexpected sight at the edge of the plain. A single figure was approaching, not in the armor of a warrior, but in the robes of a supplicant. His hair was white as sea foam, his shoulders stooped with age and sorrow, and yet he carried himself with a dignity that spoke of a lifetime spent commanding respect. It was Priam, king of Troy, who came alone to face the man who had destroyed his son. The Greek camp fell silent as Priam made his way through the ranks of warriors, his steps slow but unwavering. No man dared to bar his path, for there was something in his bearing that commanded reverence, even from those who called him enemy. Achilles, standing by his chariot, paused as he saw the old king approach. For a moment, the fire in his eyes flickered, as if the sight of Priam stirred something long buried beneath the layers of rage and grief. Priam stopped before Achilles and sank to his knees, an act that sent a ripple of astonishment through the watching Greeks. Kings did not kneel, not even in defeat, yet here was Priam, ruler of a city that had defied the greatest army the world had ever seen, humbling himself before the man who had taken everything from him. Achilles, son of Thetis, Priam began, his voice steady despite the weight of his years and his loss. I come to you not as a king, but as a father. I have seen my sons fall one by one to this war, but none has struck me so deeply as the loss of Hector. He was the light of Troy, the shield of our people, the hope of my heart. And now he lies dishonored, dragged through the dust by your hand. Achilles stood motionless, his face unreadable, but his grip on the chariot's reins tightened until his knuckles gleamed white. Priam continued, his words weaving a spell of sorrow that seemed to still the very air around them. I am old, Achilles. My life is nearly spent, and soon I will join my son in the shades below. But before I go, I beg you to think of your father, Peleus, who waits in Phthia for a son who may never return. Think of the love that binds a father to his child, the pain of knowing that child lies unburied, unmourned, denied the rights that grant peace to the dead. I beg you, not for my sake, but for the sake of the gods who watch over us all, to return Hector's body to me. Let me give him the burial he deserves, so that his soul may find rest. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant cry of a seabird wheeling over the waves. Achilles' eyes, which had burned with such relentless fury, seemed to soften, if only for a moment. The memory of Peleus, aging and alone in his distant palace, stirred something in him that the cries of Trojan widows and the pleas of Greek allies had failed to touch. He thought of his father's pride when he had left for war, the quiet hope that his son would return crowned with glory. and he thought of Patroclus, whose own body had been laid to rest with honor, surrounded by the love of those who had fought beside him. For the first time since Hector's death, Achilles felt the weight of his actions not as vengeance fulfilled, but as a wound inflicted upon the very laws that held the world together. The gods demanded respect for the dead, not because they were cruel, but because the rituals of burial were what separated men from beasts. In his grief, he had crossed that line, and the realization struck him like a blow. "Rise, old man," Achilles said at last, his voice low but carrying the weight of command. "You shame me with your courage and your sorrow. I have taken much from you, and I cannot give it back. But I will grant your request. Hector's body will be returned to Troy, and you may bury him with all the honor due a warrior of his stature." Priam's eyes glistened with tears, but he rose with the dignity that had carried him through decades of rule. "Thank you," he whispered. "May the gods grant you peace for this mercy, Achilles, even if it comes too late to save us all." The body of Hector was prepared with care, cleaned of the dust and blood that had marred it, wrapped in fine linens that Achilles himself provided from his stores. The Greeks watched in silence as Priam's small entourage carried their prince back to Troy, the gates opening to receive him with a mournful wail that seemed to echo through the ages. That night, Achilles sat alone in his tent, the divine armor laid aside, the spear of Pelion resting quietly against the tent pole. For the first time in days, he felt the stirrings of something other than rage, quiet, aching sorrow that was no less painful but somehow cleaner, purer than the vengeance that had consumed him. He thought of Priam's words, of Peleus waiting in Phthia, of the son he had left behind in Skyros years ago, and he wondered, not for the first time, what kind of man he had become in the pursuit of glory. But even this moment of reflection could not change what was coming. The fates had spun their threads, and Achilles' destiny was woven too tightly to unravel now. The mercy he had shown to Priam was a flicker of light in a soul darkened by loss, but it could not alter the path that lay ahead. Chapter 12. The Shadow of Prophecy. The return of Hector's body marked a turning point, not just for Achilles but for the entire war. The Trojans, bolstered by the honor restored to their fallen prince, found new resolve to defend their city. The Greeks, shaken by the sight of their greatest champion showing mercy to an enemy, began to sense that the end of the conflict was drawing near, not in the way they had hoped, but in a manner dictated by forces beyond mortal control. Achilles returned to battle with a ferocity that seemed tempered by his encounter with Priam, but no less devastating. The divine armor still gleamed with unearthly light, and the spear of Pelion still found its mark with unerring precision. Yet there was a new quality to his fighting now, a kind of fatalistic determination that spoke of a man who knew his time was running out. The prophecy that Thetis had revealed hung over him like a storm cloud. "Kill Hector, and your death will follow as surely as dawn follows night." The Greek camp buzzed with rumors and speculation. Some whispered that Achilles had made his peace with the gods, that his mercy to Priam was a sign of divine favor restored. Others, more cynical, saw it as the final act of a man who knew he had little left to lose. Agamemnon, ever wary of his volatile champion, watched Achilles' actions with a mixture of relief and apprehension, knowing that the son of Thetis was both their greatest asset and their most unpredictable liability. Meanwhile, in Troy, the funeral rites for Hector were conducted with all the solemnity of a city mourning its heart. The pyre burned for days, its smoke rising like a prayer to the gods, and the people of Troy gathered to honor their fallen prince with songs and offerings. But even as they mourned, they prepared for what was to come. Paris, Hector's younger brother, had taken up the mantle of Troy's defender, his skill with a bow unmatched among his people. And Paris, unlike Hector, carried no illusions about honor or single combat. He fought with the cunning of a man who knew his city's survival depended on results, not ideals. The battles that followed were brutal and relentless, as both sides sensed that the war was reaching its climax. The Greeks, bolstered by Achilles' return, pushed closer to Troy's walls, their siege engines creeping forward inch by bloody inch. The Trojans, driven by desperation and the memory of Hector's sacrifice, fought with a ferocity that matched their enemy's own. The plain before the city became a graveyard, littered with the bodies of heroes and common soldiers alike, the earth soaked red with the blood of a generation. Achilles moved through this chaos like a reaper, his divine heritage making him seem invincible even as the prophecy loomed larger with each passing day. He fought not for glory now, nor for vengeance, but for something more elusive, a sense of purpose that might justify the losses he had suffered, the choices he had made, the man he had become. Yet every victory brought him closer to the moment Thetis had warned him of, the moment when the fates would claim their due. It was during one such battle, as the Greeks pressed their attack against the Scaean gate, that the prophecy began to unfold. Achilles, leading the Myrmidons in a charge that had broken through the outer defenses, found himself separated from his men, caught in a swirl of combat that left him momentarily exposed. The Trojans, sensing their chance, rallied around Paris, whose bow was already drawn, its arrow tipped with a poison that no mortal healer could counter. From the walls above, Paris aimed, his eyes narrowing as he tracked the gleaming figure in divine armor. The shot was impossible by ordinary standards, far too chaotic, with too many variables to account for. But Paris was no ordinary archer, and the gods themselves seemed to guide his hand. Perhaps it was Apollo, who had never forgiven Achilles for his hubris, who steadied the bow. Perhaps it was the fates, ensuring that their decree would be fulfilled. Or perhaps it was simply the weight of destiny, bearing down on a man who had defied it for too long. The arrow flew true, finding the one place where Achilles' divine protection failed him, the heel that Thetis, in her desperate attempt to make her son invulnerable, had held when she dipped him in the river Styx all those years ago. The poison burned through his veins like wildfire, and Achilles fell, his great shield crashing to the ground with a sound that seemed to echo through the ages. The Greeks cried out in horror, their invincible champion brought low by a single arrow. The Trojans, sensing a shift in the tide of battle, surged forward, their courage renewed by the sight of Achilles' fall. But the Myrmidons, loyal to the last, formed a circle around their fallen leader, their spears holding the enemy at bay as they carried him back to the safety of the camp. Achilles lingered for hours, his divine blood fighting against the poison, even as it drained the life from him. In those final moments, he spoke to no one, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon where the sea met the sky. Perhaps he saw his mother there, waiting to guide him to the underworld. Perhaps he saw Patroclus, reaching out with the smile that had always been his anchor in life. Or perhaps he saw nothing at all, only the darkness that comes when a star burns out. When he breathed his last, the Greek camp fell into a silence deeper than any they had known in 9 years of war. The son of Thetis, the greatest warrior of the age, was gone, and with him went the hope that had sustained them through countless battles. Chapter 13. The Fall of Troy. The death of Achilles did not end the war, but it changed its character irrevocably. The Greeks, stunned by the loss of their champion, rallied under new leaders, Odysseus, Ajax, Diomedes, each bringing their own strengths to a conflict that had grown more desperate with each passing day. The Trojans, emboldened by their victory over Achilles, fought with renewed vigor, believing that the gods had finally turned in their favor. But the fates had not finished their work. The war would not end with brute force or divine intervention, but with the cunning that Odysseus had always wielded like a weapon. The story of the wooden horse, conceived in the fertile mind of Ithaca's king, would become the stuff of legend, a tale told and retold until it became inseparable from the war itself. Under the cover of night, the Greeks constructed a massive horse, hollow and filled with warriors, and left it outside Troy's gates as an apparent offering of surrender. The Trojans, weary of war and eager for any sign of victory, debated fiercely over what to do with the strange gift. Some, like the priest Laocoon, warned of treachery, their voices drowned out by the clamor of a people desperate for hope. When serpents emerged from the sea to strangle Laocoon and his sons, the Trojans saw it as a sign from the gods, and the horse was brought within the city's walls. That night, as Troy slept, the Greek warriors emerged from the horse, opening the gates to their waiting army. The city that had withstood 10 years of siege fell in a single night, its streets running red with blood, its temples desecrated, its people slaughtered or enslaved. King Priam died at the altar of his palace, cut down by Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, who had come to Troy to avenge his father. The fall of Troy was both a triumph and a tragedy, a victory that came at a cost no one could have foreseen when the war began. The Greeks, though victorious, found their joy tempered by the losses they had suffered: Achilles, Patroclus, Hector, and countless others whose names would be remembered only in the songs of poets. The Trojans, defeated, saw their city reduced to ash and rubble, their legacy carried away in the memories of survivors who would scatter across the known world. Chapter 14. The Legacy of a Hero. As the fires of Troy burned themselves out, and the Greek ships prepared to sail home, the story of Achilles entered a new phase that would outlast the man himself, outlast the war, outlast even the gods who had shaped his destiny. The poets took up his tale, weaving it into songs that would be sung around campfires and in royal halls, each retelling adding new layers to the legend of the greatest warrior the world had ever known. But what was that legend? Was Achilles the hero of unmatched prowess, the man who turned the tide of war with his divine strength? Was he the grieving friend, driven to madness by the loss of Patroclus? Was he the monster who defiled Hector's body, or the man who showed mercy to a grieving father? Perhaps he was all of these things, and Moray a figure too complex to be contained by a single story, too human to be fully divine, too divine to be fully human. In the centuries that followed, philosophers would debate Achilles' choices, questioning whether his pursuit of glory was worth the price he paid. Historians would pore over the fragments of his life, piecing together truth from myth, history from legend, and ordinary people, hearing his story in the quiet of a winter's night, would wonder what it meant to live a life so bright it burned out in a single, glorious moment. The prophecy that had shaped Achilles' life had come to pass, but its echoes lingered. In Phthia, Peleus mourned a son who would never return, his pride in Achilles' glory tempered by the emptiness of a throne left heirless. In Skyros, Didamia raised Neoptolemus, telling him stories of a father he would never truly know, a man whose name was synonymous with both heroism and tragedy. And somewhere beneath the waves, Thetis wept for the child she had tried to protect, her immortal heart broken by the mortal choices of a son who had defied the gods themselves. The story of Achilles is not just a tale of war and vengeance, but a meditation on what it means to be human, to love so deeply that loss becomes a wound that never heals, to strive for greatness, knowing that it will come at a cost no mortal can bear, to stand at the crossroads of destiny and choose a path that will echo through eternity. As the last Greek ships sailed away from Troy, their sails catching the wind that would carry them home, The plain before the city lay silent once more. The walls that had stood for a generation were rubble, the heroes who had fought beneath them dust. But the name of Achilles endured, a beacon for those who would seek glory, a warning for those who would pay its price. And so, as we close this chapter of history, we leave Achilles where he belongs, not in the dust of Troy, but in the stories that have carried his name across 3,000 years. A hero, a man, a legend, forever caught between two worlds, burning with a light that neither time nor death could extinguish. Chapter 15. Echoes across the sea. The embers of Troy's fires had long since cooled, leaving behind a landscape of ash and silence where a great city once stood. The Greek ships, heavy with plunder and heavier still with the weight of their losses, had scattered across the wine-dark sea, each carrying men who would never again be the heroes they had been when they first set sail. The war was over, its cost measured not just in blood and bronze but in the pieces of themselves that every survivor left behind on that desolate plain. Yet the story of Achilles, the man who had burned brighter than any other, lingered like a melody that refused to fade. In the distant halls of Phthia, Peleus sat alone, his once proud frame bent under the weight of years and sorrow. The news of his son's death had reached him not through heralds or triumphant warriors, but in the whispers of returning sailors, their voices hushed as if speaking of a god who had fallen. Peleus had known, from the moment Achilles sailed for Troy, that this day might come. The prophecy had haunted him, as it had haunted Thetis, a shadow cast across their son's life from his first breath. Yet knowing and feeling were worlds apart, and the old king found that no amount of preparation could shield him from the emptiness that now filled his palace. He walked daily to the cliffs overlooking the Aegean, where the waves sang their endless song of loss and renewal. There, he would speak to his son as if the sea could carry his words to the underworld. "You chose glory, my boy," he would murmur, his voice lost in the wind. "And glory you have won, but at what cost? Did the songs they sing of you ease the pain of leaving us behind?" The waves offered no answer, only their ceaseless rhythm, a reminder that the world moved on even when a father's heart could not. Far across the sea, on the island of Skyros, another legacy was taking shape. Neoptolemus, the son Achilles had left behind, was no longer the infant his father had known. He had grown into a young man, his features a haunting echo of the hero who had sired him. Didamia, his mother, raised him with stories of Achilles not just the warrior who shook the earth, but the man who had loved her in the quiet moments of a life that might have been. She spoke of his laughter, his music, the way his eyes softened when he looked at her, as if trying to anchor her son to the humanity of the father he would never truly know. Neoptolemus listened to these tales with a hunger that bordered on obsession. He trained with the spear and shield, his movements carrying a shadow of his father's divine grace, though he lacked the immortal blood that had made Achilles more than mortal. The people of Skyros watched him with a mixture of awe and pity, seeing in him the promise of greatness and the burden of a name that could never be escaped. "He will be a hero," they whispered, but will he outrun his father's fate? When news of Troy's fall reached Skyros, it came with tales of Neoptolemus's deeds. He had sailed to Troy in the war's final days, driven by a need to honor the father he had never met. There, he had fought with a ferocity that reminded men of Achilles, cutting down Priam at the altar of Zeus in a moment that would stain his legend with blood. Didamia wept when she heard of it, not for pride in her son's valor, but for the realization that he, too, had been caught in the web of fate that had claimed his father. The cycle of glory and tragedy, it seemed, was not yet complete. Beneath the waves, Thetis mourned in a realm where mortal sorrow could only dimly penetrate. The sea nymph, whose beauty had once drawn the eyes of gods, now moved through her underwater palaces with a grief that made even the ocean seem to weep. She had tried to protect her son, had hidden him among women, had clad him in divine armor, had whispered warnings in the language of the deep. But the fates had been stronger than a mother's love, and now she was left with nothing but memories and the songs that mortals sang of her child's deeds. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, Thetis would rise to the surface and look toward the shores of Troy. The city was gone, its walls reduced to rubble, its people scattered or enslaved. Yet she could still feel the echo of Achilles' presence there, as if his spirit lingered in the wind that swept across the plain. "You chose as I knew you would," she whispered to the empty air. "You burned so brightly, my son, that even the gods could not look away. But oh, how I wish you had chosen differently." Thetis knew that her son's name would live forever, carried on the lips of poets and storytellers who would never know the boy who laughed like silver bells or wept like the sky itself. They would sing of Achilles the warrior, Achilles the avenger, Achilles the doomed hero, but they would never know the child she had held in her arms, the boy who had run through the mountains with Chiron, the man who had loved Patroclus with a devotion that defied death itself. That Achilles was hers alone, a private sorrow that no song could capture. As the years passed, the world changed. New empires rose and fell, new heroes carved their names into history, and new wars spilled blood across the earth. But the story of Achilles endured, a thread in the tapestry of human memory that refused to fade. In the marketplaces of Athens, philosophers debated the nature of his choices, asking whether glory was worth the price of a life cut short. In the courts of distant kings, bards sang of his battles, their voices weaving a spell that made listeners feel for a moment the weight of his divine armor and the fire of his rage. Yet for those who had known him, the true legacy of Achilles was not in the songs, but in the lives he had touched. For Peleus, it was the pride and pain of a father who had sired a legend. For Deidamia, it was the love that had briefly burned brighter than war. For Neoptolemus, it was the burden of a name that demanded greatness and promised sorrow. And for Thetis, it was the eternal grief of an immortal who had loved a mortal too deeply to ever be whole again. The sea continued to sing its ancient song, carrying the echoes of Achilles' life across the ages. And somewhere, in the halls of the underworld or the starlit fields of Elysium, perhaps he walked with Patroclus once more, their laughter mingling with the wind, their bond unbroken by death or time. Or perhaps he was simply gone, his light extinguished, his story complete. But as we drift towards sleep, carried by the gentle rhythm of this tale, let us hold one truth close. Achilles was more than a hero, more than a legend. He was a man who loved, who grieved, who chose a path that burned through history like a comet. And in that choice, he reminds us all that even the brightest lives cast shadows that linger long after they are gone.